The World We Create, From God to Market, by Tomas Björkman, read by Mark Meadows. The human being creates God. During the first millennium BCE, the growing complexity and size of agrarian civilizations make it ever harder to organize society. A growing number and wider range of conflicts of interest arise between classes, cultures, and powerful individuals, both within the centers of power and across longer geographical distances. As the empires expand, the newly added and culturally diverse provinces far from the center have to be kept tightly within a larger framework and at peace. At the same time, discontent among the large urban underclasses is growing into a serious issue for those in charge. Social cohesion is of greater concern than ever, and, as a means to remedy the situation, we create God. Previously, conflicts within a community could more easily be mediated since they revolved around family members and others in the small village with whom we had personal relations and upon whom we were often mutually dependent. But in the densely populated cities of agrarian civilization, we live with people to whom we are not related and whom we do not know personally. We are now surrounded by strangers with whom we may not even share the same symbol world. This creates new societal challenges. Ancestor cults no longer suffice. New narratives are required to keep everything from falling apart. Kings and emperors also need novel ways to legitimize their authority, and the best way to do so is to seize the perceivably powerful magic of the spirits and claim it as their own. Thus, with the help of the new invention of writing, the existing animistic beliefs are transformed into coherent and formalized belief systems more in tune with the larger and more socially stratified societies. Magic thus becomes myth in the hands of a highly specialized religious elite, and the new divine narratives create shared symbol worlds that provide the necessary social glue to keep people together within communities that are largely imagined. On the one hand, this serves the needs of those in charge, but on the other, it also serves the overall stability and coherence of the much larger societies now stretching beyond the family and the clan. Gods transform us into brothers and sisters of the one true faith, but by the same token, the rulers who monopolize these myths also obtain the spiritual means to legitimize their authority. In the large cities of the late agrarian era, a great degree of uncertainty lingers regarding the question of how we should deal with the many strangers we are suddenly supposed to live with. How do we make sure that people who are no longer related and do not know each other personally treat each other with a minimum of respect and kindness? One possibility is, of course, to create laws so that people can be punished for their violations of others. But this is not enough. Ethical guidelines, which are not dependent on external control measures, are just as necessary. If people only exhibit pro-social behavior under the direct threat of force, they are likely to break the rules as soon as they believe they can get away with it. Coercing people to behave nicely is also a very resource-intensive endeavor. As such, we need new beliefs, religious convictions, to exert internal control as well. Organized religion has the capacity to transform our wills so that we not only act ethically to avoid punishment in our earthly life, but also behave well towards others to please the gods, generate good karma, and so on. And it can make us refrain from harming others in order to avoid divine punishment or secure ourselves a good position in the afterlife. It is of utmost importance that the state creates a shared symbol world and a shared identity if people are to coexist peacefully and cooperate efficiently. Organized religion, exactly because it is organized and thus has a much greater capacity to influence a larger number of people than that of a traditional animistic belief system, has the ability to create common and more expansive symbol worlds, social imaginaries that are shared by many people who do not know each other. The shared identity provided by organized religion enables us to see each other as part of a larger family. If we know the same narratives, songs, and customs, we feel that we have much more in common, which helps us to better avoid misunderstandings and conflicts. Religion permeates culture in agrarian civilization and regulates most things in life, both in private and public. Religion and legislation are usually the same, with the former providing ethical guidelines for how we should treat others. It also offers more specific codes of conduct for various everyday problems. Religious narratives can inspire us and provide role models to help us overcome many of life's challenges, which in turn can make us more resilient and well-functioning as individuals and as societies. Religion is thus a source of mental strength and societal coherence. This contains a highly evolutionary dimension. Cultures that succeed in making people treat each other well and follow rules and thought patterns that are conducive towards positive societal and personal development have a greater chance of survival than others. Just as in nature, where the most suitable genes ensure their own as well as their hosts' survival and dissemination, societies in which a favorable cultural mimetic mutation is rooted likewise increase their chances of survival and expansion. The new way of viewing the spirit world that organized religion offers does just that. Societies with strong religious sentiments increasingly win economic and military competitions with others. And as the advantages of having an organized religion become clearer, the incentives of developing such symbolic systems become all the stronger. As civilizations grow larger and more complex, we thus see the emergence and proliferation of new religious symbol systems all over the agrarian world. But as the expansion of the great empires and increasing interregional trade bring a growing number of different peoples and various symbol worlds into contact with each other, the practical question arises: how shall we relate to each other's gods? Who can lay claim to the religious truth? Whose God is the right one? And who bears religious claims to political authority? These important issues need to be resolved to make the increasingly larger states cohesive. The diplomatic solution is to add others' gods to one's own. As such, organized polytheist religions emerge with sets of gods in pantheons, institutionalized and often hierarchically ordered systems of gods with specific powers and functions. Usually the god of the politically dominant actor becomes the leader and most powerful, while the gods of conquered peoples come to represent subordinate roles. The god of a coastal people relying on fishing and maritime trade may become the god of the seas. The god of farmers may become the god of fertility, and the god of a fierce warrior tribe may become the god of war. Many new professions also see the light of day, with every guild getting its own god. These are all accepted and incorporated into the growing pantheons as long as the god of the central city is acknowledged as the god above all gods. It is also common that every city has its own god, and through the pantheon, the different cities' symbol worlds are interwoven in ways that facilitate trade and other forms of cooperation. Polytheism facilitates encounters with more distant cultures, since their gods and myths can be included in the overarching religion. These solutions also demonstrate how interactions with other cultures can spur creativity and lead to an extension of one's own culture. However, with time, the many different and often contradicting myths and local beliefs begin to cause a considerable amount of conceptual confusion that prompts more universal explanations. At this point, society has evolved so far beyond its humble beginnings that the old myths increasingly start to appear hopelessly outdated and out of tune with the higher complexity of the current social reality. The old narratives lose their trustworthiness and intellectual validity as thinkers begin to question the established customs and culturally inherited truths of their own society, speculating on whether there could be some higher truths applying to all cultures and all people, and if society could be organized in much better ways. These circumstances are at the core of what would later be called the Axial Age, the age when the great civilization's various symbol worlds emerge, cultural superstructures that permeate the everyday life of the majority of the world's populations to this day. The Axial Age is a term coined by Karl Jaspers for the period circa 800 to 200 BCE, when, supposedly independently of each other, various intellectual and spiritual traditions emerged in the great centers of civilization across Eurasia. According to Jaspers, the developments of the Axial Age have their origins in the increasing tension at the time between various centers of power, both within and between states. A development that can be interpreted in prevalent, and it may be added socially unsustainable conditions characterized as the struggle of all against all. Under these circumstances, individuals as independent social units emerge to challenge the prevailing state of affairs and confront the thinking of the majority and the elites. Old ideas, customs, and conditions are questioned and finally liquidated, which led Jaspers to characterize the Axial Age as an age of reflection, openness to new and boundless possibilities, and of man raising himself above his own self. It is the age of transcendence, the ethicization of religion, and an age characterized by the struggle of logos versus mythos, an age to bring a new self-understanding of the human being vis-à-vis the world into existence. The Axial Age overlaps with the Iron Age. The economic, agricultural, and urban growth that followed from the introduction of iron and the equally important technologically disruptive qualities of iron weapons cause increased political turmoil and warfare in both the East and the West. The many uncertainties of this transition have been argued to relate to the new intellectual and spiritual developments of the Axial Age. Changes of this magnitude, in combination with the perception of crisis, usually exert evolutionary pressures to develop new forms of social organization. It thus seems to be no coincidence that the Axial Age also coincides with the Warring States period in China, the political disruptions caused by the introduction of iron weapons into the Middle East, and the equally politically volatile situation on the Greek peninsula during the time of the Greek philosophers. However, in order for profound rethinking to appear in the midst of political and societal crisis, the existence of suitable arenas for thinkers to develop and articulate new ideas is required, as is a written medium for this to be conducted within. This requires a certain degree of autonomy from political power. Accordingly, the great axial thinkers are all to be found in cultures with highly developed literary traditions, and often in the periphery of the dominant political centers. Until the first millennium BCE, even as state power increased, religions tend to be local or regional in their claims and influence. Religions are used to legitimize state power, mobilize loyalty, and justify tribute-taking. Even if smaller regional deities are incorporated into larger ones as the empires expand, religions usually remain regional affairs with particularistic claims tied to a certain dynasty or political entity and with ethnocentric promises of protecting a particular people. Not until the Axial Age do the first universal religions appear. Even while these religions are associated with particular dynasties or empires, they proclaim universal truths and validity to all people. During the Axial Age, there is a widespread critique of the might makes right logic of agrarian society. As trade increases within and beyond the borders of the empires and societies become more commercialized, a growing number of different peoples and distinct cultures coexist and interact with each other in myriad ways. Exposure to a multitude of different and alien customs, beliefs, and ideas thus stimulates intellectual and cultural life, but it also erodes dominant myths and established convictions, which causes tensions and new problems to arise. New ideas start to emerge, and both political and intellectual challengers begin to erode the existing base of power. The old myths and political legitimacy of the established political order are scrutinized from a more critical point of view, while novel ways are sought to address the emotional needs of people and the hardships of life in agrarian civilization. Initially, the answers do not emerge within the centres of power, but among righteous rebels, at far enough distance to criticize the authorities, yet close enough to enjoy the intellectual advances made by agrarian civilization and to sufficiently affect it. What starts as a revolt against the establishment is, however, eventually adopted by the empires themselves to provide them with the necessary moral legitimacy, while the rebels gradually become part of the new established order. In the end, the rulers agree to subject themselves to the new moral order in exchange for staying in charge. They relinquish their claim to divine exclusiveness and accept the role of merely being the divine's mediators and foremost representatives on earth. With the invention of divine law, rulers must govern in accordance with higher moral principles not even they stand above, and they only uphold their political legitimacy as long as they do so. And with the invention of the soul, not only are the elites considered to have heavenly qualities, now everybody has a piece of divinity within them. An agreement is reached that rulers retain their higher status within the realms of the earthly and mundane, but in heaven, everybody is on a more equal footing, sort of. The developments of the axial traditions are, as mentioned, largely associated with the growth of the vast empires at the time in which people of diverse beliefs and cultures are governed by the same political entity. As such, it is probably not a coincidence that Zoroastrianism, the first major universal religion, appears in the Achaemenid Empire, the largest at the time, and the first to control the entire hub region of Middle Eurasia, covering a large array of different languages, religious traditions, and cultural customs. The exchange networks of Eurasia grow rapidly during the first millennium BCE, which can be seen in how the axial traditions travel along these growing links between civilizations. Not only Zoroastrianism, but also Manichaeism emerges in the Iranian lands of the Achaemenid Empire. These religions are, however, soon to be replaced by intellectual and spiritual traditions from a bit farther west. Initially, the Greek philosophies during the period known as Hellenism, following the conquest of Alexander the Great, and somewhat later with Christianity and Islam, which evolved from the Near Eastern Hebrew religion of Judaism. To the east, in India, Buddhism emerges and travels along the Silk Road to China, where Confucianism and Taoism are already developing around the same time. All of these symbolic systems differ from the previous religions and cults by their universal claims and critical stance towards the current societal and religious conditions. Some religions have supernatural overtones, such as Christianity and Islam, while others, such as the moral teachings of Confucius, do not. Hinduism, for instance, grows out of an early state religion, but most such early state traditions are abandoned during the Axial Age. All of the Axial Age religions share some novel characteristics. They make universal claims and have written orthodoxy or canon, making them more complex in nature. This is a structure that serves the ruling elites, as only they can coordinate such advanced religious services. The moral teachings of the new axial religions are the result of and highly adapted to the perceived needs of the large urban populations that appear at the time. The religious needs of farmers remain the same, however, as their productive relations with nature do not change. This causes tensions to arise between religious elites in the cities and rural inhabitants, whose religious sentiments remain tied to some kind of supernatural nature. In many religions, this leads to a great deal of compromise between agrarian and urban religiosity. Although most of the new moral religions are the result of private enterprise, the states generally abandon their old belief systems when a sizable number of people, usually in the cities, convert to such religions, or are conquered by people who adhere to such powerful universal faiths. It is highly advantageous for state elites to ally themselves with the new religions, since the universal claims and elaborate moral teachings can be used to legitimize their claims to power, and because they possess the capacity to unite peoples of many different ethnicities to a much greater degree than earlier state religions. The universal teachings of salvation become an efficient means to satisfy the emotional and spiritual needs of people, but also to govern them more efficiently. With the axial wisdom teachings, philosophies, and moral religions, civilization obtains the necessary cultural superstructure to ensure stability and social cohesion and, in effect, the continuous development of their complexity. These traditions eventually become the new cultural foundation of society, replacing the older cults and pantheons. By virtue of their universal appeal, they manage to include many different ethnicities and distinct cultures so as to eventually mold them into the great world civilizations we know today. Eventually, they spread beyond the borders of the empires that initially gave birth to them, and many even survived the collapse of the empires themselves, expanding relentlessly until they finally encounter other axial traditions with equally universal aspirations, which often causes violent conflicts to erupt. The increased social cohesion gives the societies who embrace an axial tradition a substantial competitive edge, not least on the battlefield. Those who believe the one true God stands beside them in combat increasingly win the battles. Universal religion is a powerful meme, a symbol system and a way to organize the collective imaginary no empire in the millennia to come can be without. A decisive feature of the Axial Age, according to Dalfert, as quoted by Jaspers, is man's reaching out beyond himself by growing aware of himself within the whole of being. In this process, man becomes certain of transcendence and thereby becomes human in a new and decisive sense, because it is impossible for man to lose transcendence without ceasing to be man. In other words, the human being becomes capable of transcending its current state of being, and thus, in that process, becomes something else. The human being reaches a new level of psychological development, so to speak. God, or similar notions of the divine, are increasingly seen as something recondite and separate. Abrahamic monotheism, at this time Judaism, and Buddhism both emphasize that the divine is reached beyond language and the body. Now we try to separate our mind from the material and worldly in order to attain the divine. Within Buddhism, asceticism is used as a method to attain transcendent experiences, while the material world is regarded as trivial. In Greece, Plato creates the dualist distinction between body and consciousness that has characterized European thought ever since. With the Axial Age, we seek to rise above nature. Hence, we start to wage a battle against the body's desires and impulses. We develop an existential consciousness, becoming aware of the human being's nature and prerequisites. Through this, we acquire new tools for reflecting upon the suffering that life brings. The Axial Age also entails a radically new way of thinking that manifests itself in three main principles in particular. Every person is an individual with a personal soul or spirit. There is free will, and we have personal responsibility. This was something new. Prior to this, common people were not necessarily believed to have a soul or a piece of divinity within them. This was usually reserved for the elites. In addition, individual free will and responsibility were not central to the older religions and cults. In the old Judaic religion, for instance, God measures virtues at a societal level and distributes collective rewards and punishment based on how good a society the Jews had built. In many of the axial religions, however, God measures how we behave at an individual level and hands out individual rewards and punishments. The God concept is generally formed so that it fits into the spirit of the times and the new ethical ideals. The image of the enraged God, formed by the bellicose cultures before the current era, and who was the God of his flock, thus has to give way to a more moral and caring, individually oriented God. It is possible to follow this development from the older parts to the newer ones in the Old Testament. The God concept is developed into a God we can have as a role model and a good ideal. So, to meet the demands of the time, religion will now focus on the human being's inner world, our responsibility towards others, and higher ethical ideals. In this way, Judaism is gradually transformed during the Axial Age, as the God of the Jews takes on more universalistic characteristics. In Greece, from the 6th century BCE, the old vice-laden gods are increasingly questioned by philosophers, while similar developments occur in India during the same period. The institutionalization of shared symbol worlds that the axial traditions bring about also helps to extend our moral behavior to a wider sphere. A shared identity and a commonly agreed upon morality make it easier to expand the scope of our solidarity. Personal relations of trust and pre-conventional morals are sufficient to keep smaller groups together, but to make us more inclined towards treating strangers more ethically, we need something to give us the necessary discipline and self-control. We need to start taking control of our instinctive emotions and impulses and to mobilize our willpower to fight our immediate inclinations. We have to learn how to take a step back and think before we carry out an act instead of just acting on impulse. Here, moral religion plays a central role in the cultivation of such mental capacities. It is also now that we begin to distinguish ourselves from nature and start to regard ourselves as something apart from it. The Axial Age is, as mentioned above, the age of transcendence. From the original animism, where we have been part of nature, we now separate our mind from the material and worldly in order to attain the divine. Instead of having gods with human flaws and weaknesses, particularly noticeable in the Greek tradition, the divine becomes an elevated ideal instead. We seek to rise above nature and our instincts, which are not appropriate in larger societies, and the old gods, fortified with human failings, do not offer a reliable precept. The God concept becomes more elevated, recondite, and separated from nature, more transcendent. Through willpower, the human being attempts to wage a battle against the body's biological limitations to reach the higher ideal that God or similar universal divine entities represent, with our new faiths helping us to cultivate these capacities. When we talk about faith, it should not be understood as faith in a particular religion or God, but rather what Jaspers calls philosophical faith, as faith in God, faith in man, faith in possibilities in the world. As such, faith is not mere superstition or arbitrary, naive beliefs in things not grounded in nature, but a level of consciousness that enables us to go beyond our immediate instincts and inclinations to a place where we can establish a belief in the validity of visions not perceptible to the naked eye. This should be regarded as cognitive progress. Only by enabling faith in one's capacity to see beyond the mundane is it possible to set forces in motion to realize the possibilities only visible in a transcendent realm of symbols and ideas. By trusting the mind's truth claims, even though they are not grounded in mundane reality, humans can change the world according to their wishes. This is actually a precursor to the acclaimed anti-faith doctrine of rationality, which would not have been possible if it was not for the faith in the inner eye's capacity to reach sound conclusions above the realms of mundane reality. The Axial Age thus brings a quest for transcendence into existence that should be seen as what has been called a humanizing force of human history, a process that enables us to move beyond one state of being to one where we become more conscious and more capable of taking responsibility for our own development. From earlier traditions, the myths of the humans or the gods' voyage to an inaccessible, invisible world is transferred to the new. This can be seen as an inner search for something beyond the mundane. Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad come to represent hero figures who recognize that our existing conceptions of the world are insufficient. The hero is driven to leave his home and his old self, venturing into the world to attain new insights with the support of an invisible world. The hero then returns with these new insights to his people. With the Axial Age, the human mind discovers itself as a world of its own, a distinct realm vastly different from the mundane, natural and human environment it exists in. And when this happens, it enables the human being to go beyond, transcend, that is, its immediate inclinations, emotions and prejudices, and view them from a distance. What hitherto had been subject becomes object, so that we can critically and methodologically examine the subjective part of reality, and thus ultimately alter it. This is what sets this stage of human development apart from its prior, whereas the natural world and spirit world previously appeared to be part of the same unquestioned, all-encompassing reality. Now the spirit world is something distinctly separate, something higher. The constantly growing and increasingly complex societies continuously bring forth new demands on people's ability to relate to both others and themselves, leading to major changes in religiosity during the Axial Age. Within such new religious practices, it is no longer considered sufficient to exercise rites, conduct sacrifices, and the like. Instead, religion calls upon us to gaze inwards and discover ourselves to attain greater clarity. As it was written on the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, "Know thyself." And as Socrates once famously stated, the unexamined life is not worth living. The new philosophies and religions offer methods and mental tools for reasoning about our inner world, tools that help us in developing our self-consciousness. Through these, we explore our consciousness and try to govern our will. An example of new symbol tools for this level of self-consciousness, with roots in the Axial Age, is the widespread emphasis on virtues. In all the world religions and wisdom traditions, we see a celebration of virtues that are considered morally desirable, such as humility, generosity, chastity, patience, fairness, courage, and temperance. Among the vices to avoid, there are such as greed, gluttony, laziness, and so on. Through the virtues, we receive guidance as to how we should be as humans and what we should avoid. We start to use concepts that describe new comprehensive meanings. Thus, as we gain access to these new abstract concepts, the actions, thoughts, and emotions which previously had not been subject to conscious reflection now become possible to think about and reason around. What all the major world religions have in common is that they have moral and ethical guidelines in relation to other people. An example of this is the Golden Rule. The gist of this principle is that you should treat your neighbour as you would like to be treated yourself. This idea develops simultaneously in various parts of the world, in parallel with a more moral highest principle in the form of a god or a divine semblance which can serve as a paragon and an ideal. There is an emergence of religions that do not merely require that we satisfy the needs of some god or other to gain favours in our earthly life, but rather require that we treat our fellow humans as we want to be treated ourselves in order to reap rewards in the afterlife. Buddhism distinguishes itself from the Western monotheist religions by lacking a God concept. Instead, it focuses on an absolute state of being. But this, too, is based on moral and ethical guidelines in relation to other people. Buddhism proposes careful guidance to how we can systematically develop our consciousness. One example is the Noble Eightfold Path, which is an endeavour to think and live correctly to attain nirvana. The Noble Eightfold Path focuses on wisdom in perception and thought, ethics in speech, action, and way of life, as well as meditation to increase attention and concentration. In polytheist Greece, the dramas shed light on the human being's emplacement in the world by showing the conscious and well-considered choices the hero must make to engender empathy and compassion with other people. In China, Confucius also emphasizes virtue and caring for others through his wisdom teachings. Through these new methods and precepts, we seek to reflect upon and adapt ourselves vis-à-vis that which is prescribed as more desirable. Through culture and new social imaginaries, we now get an opportunity to influence our own will. We try to influence our own consciousness, emotions, and reactive patterns through relating to higher ideals of what is right and good. Religion systematizes our ability to wish for something different and better. Our ability to consciously govern our thoughts, actions, and will is also necessary for our society to survive and to thrive, as society benefits greatly from citizens able to control their will. Around 400 BCE, in previously peripheral Europe, there has now arisen a civilization that in terms of complexity and development can be measured against and later even surpass the old civilizations in the Middle East. In wealthy Athens, a philosophy develops that will become the touchstone of Western thought. In this tradition, reason is given great focus, which 2,000 years later will constitute the foundation of a completely new thought perspective, the rational. The more philosophical and reason-oriented thinking is usually called logos, after the Greek word for word, reason, and logic. The Greeks see a close connection between thinking and the word, which is also reflected in their language. The objective of human thinking, according to Greek philosophers such as Aristotle, is to understand the innermost principles of existence through reason. Everything in the physical world is considered animated by an intrinsic purpose, an inner principle. Hence, the physics of antiquity still retains vestiges of animism's subjectivity. With Aristotle, the doctrine of teleology is developed, in which every part of reality is thought to carry an inherent telos, after the Greek word for objective or purpose. Things are still considered to have an inner world with inherent objectives and meanings, but in contrast to animism's capriciousness in the essence of nature, telos is conversely a specific law-bound property which, in accordance with the spirit of the age, can be made comprehensible through human reason. The tree or the rock both have their specific telos that imply their meaning and objective. Aristotle's approach is empirical. He studies and tests physical reality and attributes his observations to teleology. Thus, if a stone is dropped and falls to the ground, Aristotle infers that this is the stone's telos. The concepts of telos and logos will follow us through the Western history of ideas, as we shall see further on in this book. Prior to the Axial age, a myth was seen as a story, a fairy tale, which helped us learn and understand something. There was no reason-based thinking that took a position on whether what was stated in the myth was accurate in a physical or historical sense. Myths are important, since humans have a need for meaning-creating narratives to anchor our symbol worlds and keep ourselves and our societies together. Myths do not necessarily need to be historically accurate in order to be meaningful. However, with the Axial Age's rational culture, our thinking receives new features in the form of critical questioning and higher demands for factual accuracy. Where it had previously been sufficient that we received guidance and support in the myths, it is now important that they are also historically accurate. The new religious symbolic systems all strive towards universal, generally applicable explanations, but still base their stories on a mythology. The monotheist religions, for instance, all maintain that their writings have a historical foundation. For the ancient Greeks, it did not matter whether their divine legends were true or not, but for the Christians, the historical accuracy of the tales in the Holy Scriptures, not just their moral truth or narrative power, becomes more salient. The mythical narratives remain important and are not abandoned in the new religions. On the contrary, now they actually become even more important, since they also need to be true. The truth claims make it easier for the Abrahamic religions to legitimize their message in a time of more reason-based thinking. With this demand for truth, religion will, however, as we shall see, start to dig its own grave. A problem with the reading of the Bible is that the Old Testament came to exercise its influence from the perspective of the Greek translation. The Jewish rabbi, professor, and author Jonathan Sacks sheds light on how the inner dimensions of the human that the Hebrew texts have spoken of are turned into concrete occurrences in the Logos-influenced Greek language version. This fusion of Greek and Jewish thinking will later constitute the foundation for the Western symbol world during the Middle Ages. The Apostle Paul is decisive for the creation of Christianity. Paul is a Jew and a Roman citizen who converted to the new religion of Christianity. He tries to spread the Christian message in Greece, which during this time is part of the Roman Empire, where the influence of Logos is great. With Paul, the Jewish tradition and the Christian message meet reason-governed Greek culture. Hence, Christianity's ambiguity towards reason and myth begins. In the end, it is reason that will decide which writings will be included in the New Testament and how the Hebrew texts are to be translated. The start of the Gospel of John is a classic example of this through its introductory text. In the beginning was Logos, and Logos was with God, and Logos was God. In English translations, Logos is usually translated by the Word, but reason or consciousness are actually more correct translations. A few hundred years after Paul had unified Christianity with Logos, more of antiquity's doctrines are taken up by Christianity. This happens when the Roman citizen and church father Augustine, around 400 CE, attempts to integrate Plato's world of ideas with Christianity. This coalescence has a major influence on the doctrine of the Catholic Church during the following centuries. Plato argued that evil is merely the absence of good, and that there is a genuine reality, a world of ideas that is unalterable and true beyond time and space. Augustine thus argues that God is transcendent, beyond the physical world, and that the world is inherently good since it is created by God. The body is created by God and not evil in and of itself, but Augustine still regards bodily love as lower than spiritual love. Matter is lower, further from God than spirit. For the Catholic Church, the separation between the two Greek concepts of agape, love for all fellow humans, and eros, romantic love, becomes crucial. Augustine also emphasizes a free will that allows the human being to choose between turning towards God or the world. Dualism thus takes a firm place in Christian thinking. This and many other strains of thought and concepts of antiquity are then included in the doctrines of the Catholic Church. We thus arrive in the era that in the West is called the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire's decline is a fact, but its religion and written language live on into the Middle Ages and become the most important symbolic systems in Europe over the 1,000 years that follow. The preserved Greek and Roman writings will inspire later societies and even constitute the foundation for the later scientific revolution. After the fall of the Roman Empire, there has arisen a new Western European cultural sphere with a common symbolic language held together by the Roman Catholic Church and Latin written language. Otherwise, the continent is divided into a host of more or less independent states, large and small, and a multitude of varying languages and cultures. In contrast to China, whose cultural and institutional unification survives the fall of the Han dynasty, Western Europe remains divided after the fall of Rome. But on the ruins of the Roman Empire, there arises a meme fusion of various Jewish, Greek, Latin, and Germanic elements. This mixture will later prove an explosive cocktail for further development. It is important to stress that religion does not stand in opposition to reason. Rationality plays a decisive role in both Christianity and Islam. As such, the great intellectual project of the Middle Ages, known as scholasticism, is not just an irrational enterprise that science would later turn against, but rather a decisive step forward towards the reason-based, rational thought perspective that characterizes our scientific thinking today. The theological discussions of the times are actually an attempt to find a more reason-based foundation for religion. In the 13th century, the theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas attempts to combine the newly rediscovered empirical philosophy of Aristotle with Catholic doctrine. Aristotle's philosophy, which had been forgotten in Europe, returns via Aquinas, who acquired it from the Islamic culture in Spain. Initially, Aquinas encounters major resistance within the Church and is accused of heresy. But later, his integration of Aristotle's philosophy enjoys a near-total victory and becomes the Catholic Church's official philosophy. In Aquinas' integration of Greek philosophy and Christianity, Aristotle's telos becomes God's intention that exists in all parts of creation. God's purpose in creation can therefore be inferred from two sources, in the Bible's narratives and in creation itself by interpreting its telos. Aquinas also argues that God has given humans logos, reasoning, so that we may understand telos. All parts of creation have been given a telos, but only humans have received logos. Hence, there is, according to Aquinas, no contradiction between reason and the Bible, and if there appears to be a contradiction, we have either not understood God's telos or failed to interpret the Bible correctly. This line of thought becomes the basis of what has been known as natural law within Catholicism. It states that since God has given all things a telos, God's intention and will can be interpreted through observing creation. How something is created provides guidance for how we should relate to it, and from there we can arrive at a suitable course of action. We can, according to the Church, draw conclusions about how things ought to be from observing how God's creation is. If plants start to grow in the spring, then it is because God wants it so. And if night is followed by day, then that is equally the way it ought to be because it is the will of God. However, this kind of thinking can also be applied to social and political matters. If kings and popes rule and peasants obey, then it is because God intended society to work that way. The natural law of the Church is thus as much an ontological thought system as it is a political means to support the dominant social order. Natural law has long been part of the Christian thought tradition, and we can still find it, for instance, in the Church's sexual morals that consider sexual activities not intended for procreation in violation with the natural law of God, who created sex with the purpose of making children. Yet, deriving an ought from an is has proved to be an argumentative fallacy, known as the naturalistic fallacy, which was first articulated by David Hume as the is-ought problem. This is, however, a line of reasoning that is surprisingly common even today. People may argue that homosexuality is wrong because the purpose of sex is to produce babies, or that humans should not refrain from eating meat because we are evolutionarily adapted to this kind of food. It is often used to defend male dominance, that because men are physically stronger than women, then they should also be in charge. That such arguments are still heard today, despite the fact that it has been solidly established as an invalid way of arguing, may partly have to do with the firmness with which Aquinas' reasoning was established in our symbol world through the Church. The ambition to unite faith and reason thus had unfortunate consequences for our way of reasoning that persist to this day, but it was also an important step forward. Religion asks us to reconsider our actions, usually by making us think about whether they are in accordance with the ethical guidelines of religious doctrine, yet it also prompts us to take a step back and inquire into what we are doing and why. Religion makes us more conscious. It helps us develop a richer inner world from which we can imagine alternative objectives in life. From this, we become capable of shouldering more responsibility for our actions and, in a sense, become freer. We are asked to choose, not merely obey. As such, we become, perhaps rather unintended by the religious authorities, capable of questioning the morals to guide our actions. In the aftermath of the Axial age, the human being thus becomes a more reflecting creature. We are now, in a more tangible way, conscious of the fact that we are conscious, and can think about the fact that we are thinking and want to control our will. The human being starts to ask questions about itself and the world. Is there a purpose? Why do I act the way I do? How should I act? We start to reflect upon ourselves and existence to a far greater degree than before, and thus can be said to attain a new understanding about what it means to be human. The religious thought perspective is a leap in fantasy where we can imagine a conceived world, a hypothetical world that we cannot experience with our senses. While the objective of the religious authorities who cultivated these abilities in us may have been to make us conform rather than question, the consequences of this development are probably more in line with the initial intentions of the righteous rebels who pioneered the religious thought perspective during the Axial Age. With our newly won cognitive capacities to transcend and reflect, we can imagine that the world could be different from how it is now. Christianity actually mentions a potential God's realm as a better world, that there might be an ought that is better than our is. The religious thought perspective thereby provides us with the capacity to reflect upon visions of a more morally evolved world and how to create it. A hidden door in the old religious thought perspective is thus discovered, and, on the other side, we are greeted by a new perspective to be unravelled by rationality.